see what happens. So, ready? All right. Tariffs are terrible. Come on, are you kidding me? We can't raise prices like that. What's the bad thing about tariffs is that they hurt the poor the most. That's what's really disgusting about it. You know, the fat cats can always find ways to pay for things and shelter things and get things, but it's really the poor who get disproportionately hurt by tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. So when we are buying stuff from China or Guatemala or Europe, it is those things that raise the prices. So they come to the border, if there's a 20% tariff, they have to pay more. Well, that raises price at the cash register for you. Now you might be thinking, and some of you are, but Russ, Americans will create more jobs and we'll have more stimulus for American companies. Well, here's the bad part. The American prices go up too. So imagine that if Corona has a 20% tariff coming from the border and they have to raise their price of Corona, that raises the price of beer in general because there's not as much price competition for Miller and Budweiser. Our American companies don't have the same competition that they did before, and we're having less Corona and less Modelo coming across the border, and so there's increase in prices in general. So all prices tend to go up. Now I pick on beer because I like beer, but it's all across the board. Think of all the things. It's so detrimental to think about all of the various things that are connected to the global markets now. Why did it start? In 1947, there was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And it was a wonderful thing that has had unprecedented growth for the United States being the leader in free trade around the world. And so that has contributed to the growth of the economy. When I say growth in the economy, those of you who haven't been in my class, that's growth in income. That's prosperity. That's raising people out of poverty. So in places where there are no tariffs, they are generally more prosperous. So most of the developed nations joined this group, led by the United States over the years, to not do tariffs. They basically, it was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, saying, hey, let's just all agree that tariffs are stupid, and we're gonna raise prices for everybody, so let's just both not do them, right? And so if we start to look at evidence around the world, we see that the countries who maintained tariffs are at lower living standards than where we're at in the United States and other developed countries. So to impose tariffs and somehow think that that's helping America and American consumers, and maybe more specifically, less lower income American consumers, it's just not there. The data supports not doing that. So to use tariffs as a tool to get there is crazy in my opinion. So our companies, we have some of the greatest companies in the world because of trade. And so sometimes people point to the trade deficit, that we don't buy as much from or we buy more from other places than what they buy from us. It doesn't matter. The principle of comparative advantage says that we have resources in the United States that are best used here to make things that we're good at. What are we good at? We're good at machine-driven things, we're good at computer, we're good at scientific elements in the economy. We lead the world in all of these areas, and that's what's been very profitable and generated higher incomes for Americans over time. And we have been able to purchase things that are less capital intensive, less machine intensive, less education intensive from other countries. But guess what it did for them? 30% reduction in poverty around the world with people living on $2 a day. It's been a win-win situation. It's not like we won at their loss. Thank you.
Dr. McCullough, I think when you and Professor Clark and Professor Jacobson are in a room along with me, there's not that much intellectual firepower put together, assembled together in one room since Thomas Jefferson dined alone for breakfast. Folks, tariffs are necessary. Tariffs are good. Tariffs are as American as apple pie. Tariffs were the founding block of our nation's economic policy from George Washington's first term until essentially the end of the Cold War. One of the first bills George Washington signed was a tariff. Henry Clay, the great orator, tariffs. Abraham Lincoln, tariffs. McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, tariffs. General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, tariffs. Even Ronald Reagan was called by the Cato Institute the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover. Tariffs are American. They're still used today. Almost 20% of every single import that comes in is tariffed to an extent. That means Barack Obama and Joe Biden have embraced a policy of tariffs. I'm a golfer. I carry 14 golf clubs in my bag. One of them is a sand wedge. I use it once a round, maybe twice a round if I hit 2 sand traps. I use that club 2% of the time, but I need that sand wedge in my bag for emergencies. We need tariffs as an emergency. Tariffs work. Tariffs allowed us to utilize the Bessemer steel process that helped America gain primacy in the steel industry and the Industrial Revolution and in the Gilded Age. We lost that when we granted Communist China most favored nation trading status, and we saw what happened during COVID with the supply chain shortage. We saw what happened now with China utilizing production using slave labor, working with gain-of-function research irresponsibly, monopolizing the semiconductor and computer chip market, asserting hegemony in the entire region, threatening her neighbors. No, we need it for national security, and we need it to help the poor because, frankly, many of the poor people in these foreign countries are being exploited at cheap wages that are then products that are dumped here in the United States that has ravaged our industrial base and killed our cities like Detroit and Gary and Cleveland and Pittsburgh. They've never recovered from that. The death, the disease, the despair that occurred there. So tariffs protect our domestic industries. They help reduce our trade deficits. They're very powerful in fostering free trade. They're very good at contributing to government revenue. We balanced our budgets for a century and a half using tariffs. We could cut our deficit radically by an imposition of further tariffs. They also build burgeoning industries in our economy. No question that we need to rebuild steel, computer chips, and our pharmaceuticals. During COVID, our antibiotics, all of the medicines that you would use for your children someday were at the behest of China. We did not have that being manufactured here in the United States. So if you really think about pricing, we're not really talking about the efficient cost of cheap labor. There's a huge human cost to that. And so as we go forward in this debate, we're going to ask you to think that we should make America make things again, and a tariff is the key to do that. Throughout history, tariffs have been extremely successful, if only as negotiating tacticals, bargaining chips, artful dealing, modus operandi, expanding the Overton window, as we say. All that tariffs do is win, win, win. In just this last week of our own history, we have witnessed the mere threat of tariffs is having the salient effect of Canada opening up markets and fortifying the southern border, having profited and been enriched for decades by the protective nuclear umbrella at the United States, allowing them to produce things more cheaply. We have seen the threat of tariffs encourage Mexico to fight cartels and to secure their northern border. We have even seen the threat of tariffs encourage Panama to honor its treaty on the canal, secure the rescue of hostages in Venezuela, and bring about cooperation in El Salvador to hold dangerous criminals.
Tariffs reallocate to arrive at the truly efficient price of products, taking the common good into account, so as to make trade not just free trade, but fair, in order to allow Americans increasing opportunities for dignity of employment, safety at home, all the while not having to be cooperators in evil, such as what are going on in Iran and China, where we've reduced our trade barriers to them. Is it better to die and cheaply or to live justly? In an era of truth in lending, truth in advertising, is it not time also for truth in pricing? In the words of academic economist Oren Cass of the vaunted American Compass, when we recognize things in the market that market prices are not taking into account, and whether that is pollution of various forms, or in this instance, I would argue, the value of making things, the fact that domestic industrial capacity has enormous implications for a labor market, for an economy of national security, none of which market prices are going to consider. If we say, actually, we need to insert a wedge into that price that is going to reflect the cost of these benefits, yes, there will potentially be an effect on prices. But we just don't call that a sales tax and say that it's going to be inflationary, except if we, for ideological reasons, don't like tariffs. And then off we go down that historic path. So I do think that precision of language is actually really important. And I think the way that we have to understand tariffs is as a recognition that making things does matter. And if making things does indeed matter, if domestic production matters, then in fact, the market price in which we just buy cheap, subsidized stuff from China is not the efficient price. It is not the one that's actually going to maximize welfare, growth, or any of those things economists talk about in the long run. Hey, let's make things again in America. Let's make things again. Tariffs are good for this country. They protect our industries, they correct imbalances, they help us to make better, more quality, long-lasting products. They reinvest in our infrastructure and services, negotiate better deals, aid in our domestic security, identify the true efficient price, and address unfair trade practices, all the while encouraging companies to make America make things again.
Well, the funny thing is, I agree with some of those things, but strongly disagree with using tariffs to do it. So he mentioned golf, right? He's got 14 clubs in his bag. What using a tariff is like to go golfing is to bring a baseball bat. Bring a baseball bat to play golf. You're bringing the wrong tool, right? So if there's other ills that are harming our country, border control or infrastructure and a number of the things that he brought up, you're bringing the wrong tool. And that tool is a dangerous one. I am okay with tariff threats, but actual tariffs hurt people. It will hurt your bottom line. The last estimate I saw from the Tax Foundation was 142,000 jobs. As people start to reallocate around and shrink in size with lower income and lower growth, lower sales, you don't need as many people to work for you. And so it starts the great shrinking of America. If we were to start to impose tariffs and become a country showing that we can be insulated from the rest of the world through the use of tariffs, we will be in tough times, and it won't be a little slump. It'll be a 10-year slump, and it won't recover. And you know what the answer is going to be? Is after, if these tariffs actually go through, the next person's going to get elected on, we got to get rid of these tariffs. And it's going to be so obvious because the income and prosperity of average Americans and poor Americans is going to flop. And the reason is you can't bring a baseball bat to play golf. It's the wrong tool to bring. Some of our greatest companies have begun because there wasn't any tariffs in place. If they need to buy inexpensive components from a different country to build some of the electronics and gizmos that we like, they're able to do it. We're able to freely trade with our brothers and sisters around the world. The United States recognized this early on, and that's what this country's been built on. Apple pie, yeah, it's something that's been around. It still tastes good, but we got nice big apple fritters now. We got a lot more tastier things because all of the things that we've been able to do to branch out from apple pie. So apple pie is great, but now we can have apple pie and apple fritters and apple juice and apple cider and apple donuts. All of that innovation and technology is at least in part due to the fact that we haven't imposed tariffs over time. To tax things coming across the border will stifle America, stifle the American dream. So, tariffs are terrible. It hurts our poor. It hurts the poor people around the world. Again, 30% drop in poverty over time just from opening their borders. In my class, some of you who are in here, we did the trade game. And just by allowing countries to trade freely with each other increases prosperity, it increases happiness. And so the ability to do that, the ability for entrepreneurs to start a new business and not just sell to Americans, but to be able to sell to Canadians and to sell to Mexicans and to sell to people in Europe and all over the world is a tremendous advantage for us Americans and has worked so well over the years. So my big thing is, don't bring a baseball bat to the golf course. There's a lot better tools that we can do to hit those issues head on. They are important issues, I'm not denying that. We just don't want to bring the wrong tool or the wrong club to play the sport. Thank you. Oh, here, Peter. Yeah, that is.
At this point, we move to phase 3 of our debate, which is the crossfire question section. Again, there will be 8 total minutes for the 2 debaters to ask questions of one another. I'll allow them somewhat of self-governance unless it gets out of hand. Once that's done, we'll be doing audience Q&A, so be prepared with your questions.
So, Doctor.
Yes, sir.
You've admitted that tariffs do sometimes work, at least the threat of tariffs.
The threat,
Okay.
but not the tariff itself.
Okay. Now, currently, we just saw in the last week a lot of movement with tariffs as a tactic, bringing about some economic good news for the United States. Let's take a walk down memory lane here. We have 20% essentially rounded, you can fact check this, of all of our current imports coming in are tariffed to an extent. And that helped through the Biden and Obama administrations. Are you arguing that we should even go more dramatically and even erase what the good Democratic presidents were arguing for, along with the Republicans, for a tariff base to help with our national sovereignty so that we can develop steel and have our pharmaceuticals and our microchips here? Is there not some merit in following what Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and Reagan did in not going for a bottom line figure, but going for a national security and domestic jobs frontier that perhaps can't be immediately quantified, but nonetheless works toward an efficient price?
Do you like cheese?
I like cheese, but I like to eat it with a spoon and not a baseball bat.
So the items that he's talking about that have maintained tariffs have had tremendous lobbies in Washington to maintain some protection. So there's no doubt that tariffs will protect certain industries. So this last round of tariffs that was most recent during Trump 1.0, that continued on with Biden, Biden didn't overturn it, was the steel tariffs. And so the steel industry loved it, and maybe a few pennies were spread out among us. The costs were there, but these industries have had kind of a long, that's one example of one that hasn't been a long-standing protection of certain industry, and that's more of a fault of our political process than it is good sound economics. And so I would be all for those tariffs also going away so we can get some cheaper cheese. There's good cheese around the world.
I would argue absolutely contrary to that. We are in a situation now where we have aggressive communist Chinese hegemony, which threatens its neighbors Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, even New Zealand, even Australia. We are held hostage in many ways right now. Could we make military items? Can we have charge of our own pharmaceuticals?
What about our semiconductor chips? At some point, from a national security standpoint, when you have an aggressive competitor who is co-opting the very items that you need for your existence, doesn't it become a national security issue at that juncture to essentially make them pay a fair price? Remember, the Chinese are doing this with slave labor. They're forcing the Uyghurs in concentration camps to make these items. Children are slave labor making various items for them. We know that they were irresponsible when we exported the gain of function research to them. We probably shouldn't have exported that. Is there a point where we can live cheap and die, and it would be better to live justly and live more domestic tranquility? Dr. McCullough, question. That the ravages of Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Gary, Indiana, we lost 20 million manufacturing jobs.
Hold on, let me jump in
Go
here
ahead.
already.
Go ahead.
So this is crossfire, so I think I'm well within my bounds here to jump in. Listen, the COVID taught us one thing, that the supply chain and dependence on China was probably a little too heavy. But here's the deal, a lot of people didn't die because they didn't have toilet paper, or because our chips in our car, we had to slow down manufacturing of Chevy trucks or something. Nobody was dying. We got that turned around, the market corrected itself, we found other pathways. What's been going on since COVID? There's been new developments of new industries in different countries. And so now we've learned to diversify, right? So this is what I teach in personal finance class too. When you take your investments, you gotta diversify, baby. You don't wanna put all your eggs in one basket. We had too many eggs in the Chinese basket, and we've learned from that. And so by having these items more diversified in production throughout the world, that national security argument, while it might hold water in the first 3 months or 6 months or something, it doesn't hold water in the long term. And I think it'll ultimately reduce our freedoms and reduce our incomes and lead to the poor.
Do you have a question, Russ?
No, I was responding to his question.
No, I know you were, but
Okay.
otherwise he's gonna ask another.
No, go ahead. I do have a question, but why would you use tariffs to hurt consumers instead of, if the border, just to pick out one issue is the border, why would you use a tariff? Why would you think that would be more effective than increased police or something at the border? A different tool.
Because economics is always the weapon that people respond to. Always follow the money. Iran was nowhere near nuclear power when all the countries agreed to essentially tariff and blockade nuclear materials from going into Iran. That worked. It, in many ways, would reduce costs, Dr. McCullough, I fervently believe. The tariffs that were imposed throughout our nation's first 150 years totally paid for our budget. We did not have an income tax because of the tariffs and duties income that we had. While we imposed those, that gave our folks the ability to compete fairly and freely against dumping and build these nascent beginning industries. The cost during COVID was rather severe. When I served in the legislature, there were some acute supply chain shortages. There were computer chips in motor vehicles that simply could not be had. There were
Okay, those days of tariffs that you're talking about, those days are gone. That's when the national budget was about 3% of the gross domestic product, our national income. Right now, that spending is at like 25%. And so our deficit, our imports coming in might amount to, let's say, $4 trillion. If we put 100% tariff, that still wouldn't pay our bills in the United States. It's actually impossible for us to be in the same position we were 100 years ago with somehow being able to effectively pay and a lower income tax at our current level of spending. Now, I think you might agree that maybe we could lower spending, but I don't know if that's in the cards or not. We gotta hold that constant.
it would be an incremental increase in revenue, though, all things being equal. If we went from basically the 20% base that we have now to a higher base, that would bring substantial revenues in.
All things aren't equal, because when we raise price, students, what happens to the quantity you want to buy when you raise price?
But you're not
They go down.
But you're not really raising the price. What you're doing is you are putting a duty on the product that's incoming to set an artificially low price,
due either to dumping or exploiting the poor people in those countries. I would say it's an act of social justice to ameliorate that by taxing the perpetrator, and then people in America
Okay,
will
take
have
what
a
he
fair
said, and
fight.
it's just the opposite. It will hurt them. And we're out of time. All right.
Okay, so we've now moved into the audience Q&A. We'll have 60 minutes for audience Q&A. You can direct your questions to either Professor Jacobson or Professor McCullough, or both, if the question is for both of them.
You run that around.
And yeah, so the plan will be I'll run this mic around, and then Professor Jacobson will share with Professor McCullough. And so I'll start going around. I see some questions.
This is for Professor Jacobson. Are you advocating for like a whole global tariff, or just on countries like China, Mexico, and Canada?
I think you have to be targeted and tactical, largely, precision, surgery, obviously. There are some nations that do not deserve most favored nation trading status. Iran and China, North Korea would be three of those. But I think your question is very excellent, because we're getting right down to it. The reason we need to impose these is precisely to help with income inequality in these foreign countries where the people are so taken advantage of. When they're paying slave wages to people and we're buying their products so cheaply, does not that prick our social conscience into saying maybe the efficient cost isn't buying the bottom line cheap product, maybe for the common good and for total freedom of our neighbors worldwide, we need to take that step of maybe paying a smaller price right now for what is socially just. Is it too much to say, as Orrin Cass said, that if domestic security and our national sovereignty is important, how can you put a price tag on that? When do we sell out our own people here for 30 pieces of silver? There's more than silver involved here. And so I think your question is excellent, because you're looking at the macro standpoint. There are many nations that regularly trade freely with us, that these nations that we're talking about putting tariffs on are the very nations that are putting 50 and 75% tariffs on us. I agree in free trade. There should be, in a perfect world, everybody get along. But the reason we have to impose some of these maybe 20, 25% tariffs is because the very nations that we're slapping them on are imposing 50 and 75% tariffs on us. Folks, Canada will let very little into Canada from here without a huge tariff. Same thing with China. You have to literally build factories in China to be able to do business in some of these places.
That's the cheese again. So our cheese will be a lot cheaper if they did. I just wanted to comment, because it's a good one, that, whether they're targeted. So it kind of comes back to the baseball bat and the golf club. But here's the deal. If we impose a tariff, Americans lose. Americans lose through higher prices of foreign products, but also higher prices of American products, like I talked about. But what's worse and what's likely is what's called a tit-for-tat strategy. What I do to you, you do to me. So Justin Trudeau mentioned that he was going to do that in Canada, for instance. We put on 20%, they put on 20%. What happens then is that the losses are even more. America even loses more. And so, since you praised me for following Milton Friedman once said, we should unilaterally decrease tariffs, even if our competitors don't, because that makes Americans better off. So the logic works the opposite way too. We don't want to go one direction.
It's a good argument. I would also remind you that Milton Friedman said that even the Smoot-Hawley tariff did nothing to really cause the Great Depression. And I again come back.
We're going to hop on to the next question.
Let me just finish one quick thing here. Without the tariffs, without our young man over there who asked about strategic tariffs, you have to put tariffs on for polluters. We have massive pollution going on in some of these countries that are cut rates.
Do it another way.
And labor standards. Again, these people have no labor union protections. They're working more cheaply, and they're charging our people 75% tariffs to do business in their country. I'm a lawyer. It has to be just. You can't say we're going to give away the farm and that it costs us 75% to go and play in their neighborhood.
Okay. We're gonna move to the next question, and Russ, if you want to, when it's your turn with Mike, you can also address that at some point.
I have a question about, you mentioned that it'll hold water tariffs for 3 to 6 months. Do you think that short-term tariffs would be good?
There's no such thing as a short-term tariff. So once that is in and people start to adjust their expectations, it's not going to do. So the longer-term thing is when people realize that it's here to stay and they start adjusting long-term decision-making. In fact, we were just talking with a graduate today that visited my class, Jacob Michael, and I asked him at lunch with Dr. Jacobson over here, what did he think for his private equity firm would be the worst? And he said the tariffs. They've already not done deals because of the threat of tariffs even. It creates more uncertainty. They have to price that uncertainty in the market. It's already causing problems and it hasn't even been imposed yet. Now, still, the threat thing, like I said, but if it goes into place, I'm not in it.
But this is Schrodinger's cat here, Dr. McCullough. If you can threaten it, you have to be able to follow through with it. It's like a poker game. Who knows who's bluffing, who knows who's not. But you have to have not just the potency, but the actuality. We all learned that in philosophy class. And again, at this juncture, we've got to drill this home. What we're saying, if we're totally free trade and anti-tariff, is that we have to lower our guards and let them bring in all of their dumped products at artificially low prices, often off slave labor in nations that pollute heavily, while at the same time, if we want to introduce our products into their country, they make it absolutely impossible for us to compete in their large markets. That is a rigged mugs game against the American people. And when I look at the people from Gary, Indiana, and Detroit, Michigan, and Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, and our destroyed manufacturing base, and the tens of millions of lives that were ruined here with disease and death and despair, we can do better. We can do better. And we can build the economies and the nascent industries here that give us more sovereignty in the long run.
I care more about the American poor than the other country's poor. My philosophy professor partner, Dr. Clark, who couldn't be here, has this permissible partiality. So it's okay for me to want to care more about the people close to me. And so I'm going to give them priority first.
It's me, Jesse again. My question for you is, say we institute this tariff against China, what's to stop us from simply buying from somewhere else instead of making it here?
That's a very good question. And I want to say I agree with Dr. McCullough in caring for the poorest near you, perhaps more. That's why I invoked immediately before that Cleveland and Gary and Pittsburgh and Detroit. The problem right now is that many of these other countries don't make these products. Literally, China and Taiwan and Hong Kong, who China has potential designs on, they've got the corner on the semiconductor and computer chip market. There were cars, literally, the auto dealerships in the Midwest during the COVID supply chain crisis literally had no cars in the lots. They could make the car in Detroit, they could make the car in Tennessee, they couldn't get the semiconductor chips from China. Young mothers that needed antibiotics for their children, people who needed certain specialized drugs to treat cancers, were having supply chain disruptions because China was the only nation making those pharmaceuticals. Guys, this is life or death. These are life and death situations. You can't not allow an aggressive competitor a corner on your infrastructure and healthcare products that literally mean the life and death of your society, your culture, and your industry.
Baseball bat. It might be life or death, I'm not going to dispute that, but it's the wrong tool to use. Another question?
Okay, so you keep saying it's like bringing a baseball bat to a golf course, or it's not the right tool. What are the right tools? Because Professor Jacobson brings up some very valid points about national security, peace, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So hitting the problem, let's say border control, beefing up our own patrol, possibly purchasing, building a wall, doing other security checks, basically hitting things that are direct on rather than this indirect tax on imports to do it. Now, it's a great threat. And so if we have a president that comes off kind of, wow, this guy might just do it, it's kind of a brilliant move. I'm not going to deny that. But if he goes through with it and actually does it, it's super detrimental. So it's like we're playing with dynamite. And so to have that go through, like I said, the threat of it I'm okay with, but it's got to stop there, and I'm not sure it's going to stop there. And so another policy of helping the poor or something, rather than to threaten a tariff if they're not doing it, to restrict trade of that country, which we've done in the past. So we won't take products if they don't show that they're not using slave labor or child labor or something like that. So rather than wielding this tariff around as the tool, I think it's a dangerous tool, and if it gets pushed, if push comes to shove and we're in a corner and it gets put into place, it's going to be really bad for the United States, and it's going to be a hard one to dig out.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. Sharon, that's a great question. I think it's an existential question if we do not tariff. When we had a tariff, a worldwide tariff, on any weapons grade material, including radioactive, going into Iran from 2017 to 2021, and when we put economic tariffs on Iran, they were starved, they were broke, they were on the ropes. When we rescinded that policy, we saw what happened on October 7th, a year and a half ago. Tariffs can save lives existentially by wielding the baseball bat economically, because October 7 wouldn't have happened if we had had those strict tariffs in place against Iran.
Question for Mr. Jacobson. I understand the importance of having access to pharmaceuticals, but why do you think it will benefit us to manufacture goods here when we have a higher cost of labor and may not have the comparative advantage for most resources? And how do you think that will affect our low-income people?
That's an excellent question, and what I would tell you is the biggest driver right now of healthcare costs is a medical industrial complex. And part of our problem has been that there have been tariffs internationally, even involving medicines and the ability to get medicines. Right now, the regulatory environment in the United States is such that we are disallowing cheaper medicines to coming into the United States. We also have regulatory people in the United States that are suppressing certain medicines that other nations are freely distributing, effectively curing their people. So it's a very complex issue, and right now what you see is there's been a great deal of corruption in the big pharma industries. Many of them are offline, and the real critical problem that we have right now is we have nations that are doing gain-of-function research in biolabs, risking the release of another accidental pandemic escaping from a lab. Again, they're not under labor standards, they're not under pollution standards, they're not under the regulatory standards, Olivia, that we have here in the United States. We've exported those out freely to our own death and destruction. There are some things that need to be done in the United States that should not be exported out. Gain-of-function research is one of those. And if you freed up the regulatory market here and made big pharma, big pharma goes across the river and they dump on us and sell their pharmaceuticals at 1/10 of what they're charging us here. That also is not fair trade. So you need to use the weapon against that bad behavior as well.
And that weapon's not that baseball bat. Reduce the restrictions that are in the pharmaceuticals, that the big lobbies in Washington, those are the things that keep those costs high. We don't have freedom to purchase our drugs from other places around the world. And so things like the Federal Drug Administration has held that up. go directly at the problem. Don't use tariffs to do it.
Okay, this will be the final question. We've got about 2 minutes left.
This one is for Russ. Is there anything to be said that tariffs could combat the consumerism problem in the United States and the overconsumption that we generally see?
No. So consumerism, I mean, the idea of materialism or consumerism, you know, it's kind of like greed. It's not going to go away. I don't think a tariff making things more expensive is going to lower that human nature, I would argue sinful nature, to want to consume more and more. And so people have to have themselves in check. And what a tariff does is it lowers incomes for everybody, as I've argued, leaving us in a worse position. And so I think similar to like if we raised the price domestically by law, if we had extra taxes, it wouldn't help that issue as well. And so the tariffs would just be less of an impact visually because we're doing it on the foreigners, but I don't think it would address that issue.
Yeah, Trevor, that's a really good question. I would say this. The American people, when left to last resort, always do the right thing. During the Civil War in America with high tariffs, part of that argument economically was about tariffs. Despite paying some higher prices during wartime, people like my great-great-great-grandfather enlisted in the Illinois Infantry in Mr. Lincoln's Army to go down to Kentucky to free the slaves. He contracted typhoid by the end of the war, was ravished for the rest of his life, ultimately received a pension from Benjamin Harrison. But he believed that some things were more than just the bottom line dollar. In World War II, when Nazism crushed America, we saw the American people sacrifice together with tariffs, paying a slightly high price, but nonetheless girding through it. There could be some price increases with tariffs, but I would argue they're not imposed prices. They're really the actual efficient price that we have not justly been incorporating into our pricing mode right now, to the detriment of our poor, disaffected manufacturing base in America, and to the detriment of our national security and sovereignty. Thank you.
All right, we are at our final section of our debate. In this part of the debate, each candidate will provide their closing statements. Reminder, each closing statement is supposed to be 2 minutes. So closing statements, each closing statement, 2 minutes.
Who goes first?
All right, well, we've come to a close, and I just have to say thank you, John, for trying to defend a really undefendable position. It's tough. He did as best as anybody could, but it's pretty simple, isn't it? If we raise prices, you get hurt, other people get hurt. There's unimaginable impacts to the supply chain and little things. If we're bringing eggs to market, where did that egg carton come from? Where did the driver come from? Where did the truck and its machinery, all of the parts in our global economy, usually over 50% of the things we buy that are made in America aren't really made in America because the parts and components are coming from other places. I mean, it would be so detrimental to have across the board tariffs or tariffs even on individual countries. Any sort of tariff, period, hurts Americans. If those tariffs are reciprocated, which they usually are by the other country, Americans are hurt even worse. So just don't do them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. We've got to go tariffs. We've got to embrace them more thoroughly. Chinese car costing $10,000, American car costing $15,000. Chinese car built with slave labor, no pollution standards, no worker rights, dumping into America, flooding the American market. That's grotesquely unfair when they will not allow our products to enter their country. That's grotesquely unfair. So the way you do it is you slap a 5,000 tariff on them. Both automobiles are now $10,000. What that does is it gins up demand in the United States. It
revitalizes our urban areas. It creates jobs in all of these industries, jobs, tax revenues, everything. This was the American policy from George Washington through Lincoln, through Eisenhower, through Kennedy, even Biden and Obama recognized 20% tariffs. The resolution says tariffs are bad for America. Well, that's a universal statement. All tariffs are not always bad for America. Some tariffs are absolutely necessary for our national security and for the economic health of our people. It worked last week alone. The beginning of tariffs with 5 different countries brought about behavior that is good for America. Let's make America make things again. Vote negative. Vote negative on the proposition. Tariffs are terrific. Thank you.